So, Professor Fabbrini, thank you very much for joining us. So the purpose of this special section is to use the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the armistice of World War I to reflect on Europe's current crisis and put it in some historical context. So from your perspective, what do you see as the key challenge to Europe right now, and how do you rank that current crisis in the context of Europe's past?
In many ways, the challenges that Europe is facing today are analogous to those they were facing at the end of World War I. Allow me to start with actually a personal note. I come from the city of Trento in the middle of the Alps, which used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and became Italian exactly at the end of World War I, so 100 years ago. And the region I come from has been a border region which has moved from one state to the other over the course of history with strong ethnic and religious tension, which were overcome through the process of European integration. But what we see today in Europe increasingly is a return to nativism, to nationalism, and this challenges, of course, the achievements that were obtained over the last 100 years in the process of integration. As everyone knows, in fact, the end of World War I did not achieve long-lasting peace. It was only a temporary solution. The Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany, and that paved the way towards the Second World War, which was in many ways even more dramatic than World War I. But I think the great conquest of Europe in the second half of the 20th century was precisely to overcome the need for interstate war and the reasons of interstate conflict by creating a supranational structure of integration. Now, at the beginning of the 21st century, I think that supranational project is increasingly challenged, and that raises important questions for the future of Europe.
And just to think about the ranking of the crisis, the current challenge we have from nativism and from populism, which is certainly on the rise, how serious do you see that challenge?
I think it's a serious challenge. We are experiencing a paradigm change in European politics. Elections in a number of member states, including some founding members of the European Union, have increasingly exposed a return to an identitarian and nationalist rhetoric, which is essentially at odds with the logic of interdependence of the project of European integration. So we are in for a rough sailing in the waters in the years ahead, and I think it becomes all the more important for those who believe in the project of integration as a peace project to reaffirm the reason for bringing the states and the peoples of Europe together.
It's very interesting that you talk about reaffirming the project of European integration, because I know last year you were the co-author of the Rome Manifesto, which proposed almost a refounding of the European cooperation through institutional and legal reform. Could you talk us through the motivation for the manifesto and maybe some of the key points as well?
Yes, the occasion for drafting the Rome Manifesto, which was sponsored by the Italian-German Center for European Excellence, was to take advantage of the 60th anniversary of the Treaties of Rome, originally signed in 1957, which started the process of European integration, and to somehow reaffirm, as you said, the foundational values of that project at a time when those values are increasingly being challenged. The idea was that Europe belongs to its citizens. The idea behind the manifesto was to involve young European citizens who are actively engaged in promoting the cause of integration, making clear that the rhetoric and the rhetorical argument are not only in the hands of the anti-Europeans, those who want to destroy the European Union, but that in fact there is a strong movement, popular movement, in favor of defending the achievements of over 60 years of European integration. The project resulted in a manifesto, which of course is inspired even in the terminology from the Manifesto Ventotene, originally drafted by Altiero Spinelli during World War II, which was envisioning a free and united Europe against the dark ages of Nazi fascism. And the manifesto was later presented to the European Parliament in Brussels, offering to members of Parliament a possible path forward in rethinking the reforms of the European Union in the years ahead to address the challenges that European citizens have identified.
And just on that, I suppose, because you mentioned Altiero Spinelli, of course, the vision of Europe that he had, in some ways, to what extent do you think the EU has managed to deliver on that vision, particularly on the social aspects of Europe?
It is amazing to think that someone like Altiero Spinelli in the early 1940s, in the middle of World War II, when Nazis and fascist regime were engaged in the Holocaust, extermination of 6 million Jews, Altiero Spinelli was jailed in a small island in the Italian Sea, and on its own, alone, he managed to draft a document that conceived of a Europe that was totally different, a Europe that was united rather than divided by war, a Europe that was free rather than enslaved by dictatorship, and a Europe where interdependence and integration would replace conflict and power games between nations. And I think that vision has succeeded. At the end of the day, after World War II, the founding fathers of the European Union were able to create something that gave this continent the longest lasting period of peace in history. So many of the dreams, because they were dreams at the time of Altiero Spinelli drafting the manifesto, were achieved. But of course, global challenges, the surrounding environment, internal dynamics have changed very much since these days. So I think we need to remain loyal to the vision of Spinelli that conceived of a peaceful, free and united Europe. But of course, I think we need to update the mechanism and the institutional systems by which these objectives are to be achieved.
And of course, that's going to be a particular challenge because we've seen, particularly after the Lisbon Treaty negotiations and the failed constitutional project that preceded that we may have entered a certain degree of integration and reform exhaustion or fatigue at the EU level. What do you see as how you can address the key political challenges to pursuing this kind of reform?
Well, the Lisbon Treaty was seen by many as being somehow the end point of the process of reform of the European Union. But I disagree with this vision because what we have experienced since the entry into force of the Treaty of Lisbon is in fact a continuous process of adaptation and piecemeal change of the EU institutional system. The Euro crisis and the migration crisis were the two biggest trigger for change, and often change did not happen formally within the structure of the treaty itself, but rather outside the treaty through the use of intergovernmental agreements, sometimes by a minority or just as a subgroup of member states. But change has still existed, and new structures, particularly in the context of economic and monetary union, have been created. And I think there is a need for Europe in reality to continue readapting and reforming itself. And yet, precisely the experience we have witnessed since the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty is that the current treaty revision procedure is simply dysfunctional. A European Union made of 28, soon 27 member states, where every member state wields a veto on treaty reform, it's simply unable to reform itself. And that's why, of course, a number of states have been pushing for reforms outside the treaty framework by adopting side agreements, but that creates a challenge of its own. So I think a key priority for Europe as it moves forward is really to rethink also some of the rules of the games and particularly treaty revision procedures.
One of the responses or one of the ways of getting around that, as you said, has been negotiating side treaties, negotiations among groups of member states. In some cases, I think it's 26 in the Fiscal Stability Treaty, for example. Do you see in the future the emergence of what I might call a two-speed or a multi-speed Europe?
I think this is a realistic prospect because of two simultaneous dynamics that are taking place. On the one hand, you see a process of disintegration very visible with the decision of the United Kingdom to leave the European Union, and there are a number of member states which are essentially making the case for a dilution or reduction of the depth of European integration. But at the same time, you have another group of member states, today mostly led by Emmanuel Macron's France, which are pushing for deepening integration, particularly within the Eurozone. Now, these two simultaneous and conflicting dynamics can only be reconciled really through a kind of a Europe of concentric circles, which is different from the two-speed Europe that had been discussed by scholars and policymakers for many years, because whereas the two-speed Europe was based on the assumption that all states were moving in the same direction, albeit at different speed, what I think we are increasingly witnessing is that we have two different destinations of the process of European integration. Some countries are really committed to a political project, the creation of a political union, while other member states are essentially interested exclusively into the economic dimension of integration. And to reconcile these different interests, this different vision of la finalité de l'Europe, I think having a system of concentric circles might be the way precisely to keep within the internal market everyone while allowing those who want to deepen their political integration to do so.
So what I'd like to move on to now is some of the more specific challenges facing the EU. One of the key problems we've had, and you've already touched on this issue of the rise of nativism and populism within the EU itself, is the issue of member states starting to backslide around issues of the rule of law, around questions of liberalism, their commitment to human rights. And so for the first time, the EU has instigated Article 7 proceedings against both Poland and Hungary. And do you think these measures will be sufficient to deal with this challenge?
The challenge of rule of law backsliding is, in my view, the most significant challenge that the European Union is currently experiencing. Of course, we also have the euro crisis and the migration crisis, and we might talk about it in a few minutes, but the rule of law crisis is an existential challenge for Europe because it essentially calls into question the foundational values on the basis of which the European project was developed, which is democracy, the rule of law, respect for human rights and individual freedoms. The European Union designed instruments to deal with potential challenges by some of its member states, particularly at the transformative period of the Treaty of Maastricht, ahead of the large enlargement to Central and Eastern European countries. But the truth is, in reality, the European Union has stronger leverage in terms of enforcing human rights principles and rule of law ideas vis-a-vis countries which are not yet members of the European Union, so accession countries, as opposed to countries which are already members of the European Union. And the fact that Hungary and Poland have effectively been able to sidestep any criticism from the EU institutions and the other member states for 5 or 6 years now, it's a proof of the fact that the internal mechanisms existing in the European Union are not sufficient to deal with these issues. And yet, something has to be done because a challenge to the rule of law is, in fact, a challenge to any single policy of the European Union. An internal market cannot function if judges in a given member state are not independent, are not able to enforce ruling against the executive branch. And therefore, the very basic policies of the European Union, competition, free movement of goods, free movement of persons, would essentially come to a halt vis-a-vis one of such member states. In a way, what we are witnessing with countries like Hungary and Poland is effectively a kind of semi-exit from the European Union. They are not formally withdrawing, as the United Kingdom has been doing by triggering Article 50 of the TEU, but they are selectively choosing which norms of the European Union they want to comply with. This is inevitably going to lead towards the disintegration of the current EU if it isn't addressed properly.
It's interesting that you mentioned the pre-accession, post-accession almost paradox, that it's easier to influence non-member states than it is to influence member states. Do you think there's any reform, as part of the reforms you were talking about earlier, that could be undertaken to provide the EU with a more robust mechanism for keeping member states on track?
It isn't easy to do so because the European Union was built essentially as a Rechtsgemeinschaft, a community of law. The EU doesn't enjoy a police force. There's no EU army that is able to, enter into a member state and enforce the rulings of the European Court of Justice. The old system is premised on the fact that member states will comply with the law and will be themselves law-abiding nations. But we are at that point in history where, because of the backsliding we are witnessing in a number of countries, this is no longer the case. And therefore, I think as we look forward to the future of Europe, we need to rethink the mechanisms which are available to the EU institutions to police compliance with EU principles, EU rules, and EU values. And I think it's interesting to consider what had been some of the early projects, particularly in the 1950s, at the time of the foundational period of the European Union, the draft treaty establishing a European political community actually gave to the supranational institution an enforcement power through collective military force by the other member states vis-a-vis a country which was not abiding anymore to EU principles. At that time, the great concern was that some member state might be overtaken by communist parties, moving some Western countries towards the Eastern Bloc, but certainly that reflected a very serious concern of any federal polity. How can the federal government, the central government, make sure that its laws, its writs are respected across the whole Union?
And really, I suppose what the EU has relied on to date in practice has been that sense of community, this idea of a group of nations working together towards a very similar end. One of the challenges that sense of community has faced quite strongly over the last decade or so has been the challenge of refugees from the global south, and the issue of how burden sharing can be negotiated among member states. Again, do you see the prospect for institutional reform, or is this essentially a political problem?
It is a political problem, but it is also an institutional problem. The European Union had started creating a common European migration policy from the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s, at a time where actually there wasn't such a major challenge of migration from the global south toward Europe. With the Syrian conflict and climatic transformations in Africa, we have experienced over the last 5 or 6 years a huge wave of people fleeing war-torn countries and moving toward Europe. And that has obviously challenged to the point of unsustainability the current rules and regulations, notably the Dublin regulation that are designed to manage the migration phenomenon. The obvious problem is that in a European Union which is mostly run on an intergovernmental basis, where member states in the Council and the European Council are taking decision in this field, it's very hard to find a compromise to move beyond the current system, because the interest of coastline borderline member states in the Mediterranean Sea notably are obviously very different from those of Northern or Eastern European countries, which are not on the front line and therefore would gladly somehow leave the problem to their sister states. And as a result, we are essentially witnessing a paralysis of any effort to reform the common European asylum and migration system. And this is, again, seeding discord among states, potentially triggering further processes of disintegration of the European Union.
Just to pick up on that, because looking at the Mediterranean states, obviously Italy is the big case where there's a very particular challenge to European integration, where you have a founder member state who seems to be at least at risk of engaging in the kind of backsliding we've seen in some of the newer member states. How can the EU adapt to this kind of challenge, where it's something that's so fundamental to the Union itself?
The transformations we have seen in Italy are remarkable. Italy used to be one of the most pro-European member states of the European Union. Altiero Spinelli was, of course, Italian, and traditionally Europe was perceived by the population as a light post, in many ways as a role model for what the Italian state could have been. And yet, over the last few years, we have witnessed a remarkable change of public attitudes towards European integration, which is essentially the result of two of the biggest crises the European Union has faced since the turn of the century, the economic crisis and the migration crisis. And on both these crises, Italy felt abandoned by the European Union. On the economic side, the argument has been that Europe imposed austerity policy, which negatively affected the growth rate and unemployment in the country. And on the other hand, on the migration crisis, the argument has been, I think rightly, that because Italy is a borderline member state, it fell on it to manage the burden of handling migrants entering into the European Union. So in a way, it is ironic that Italy, a founding member state, has become anti-European, and yet what I think the recent shift also show is that Italy is becoming anti-European because Europe is not doing enough. So it's not an anti-Europeanness in principle, it's a criticism of what the European Union is doing at the moment, which isn't enough solidarity in managing the migration crisis and not enough, again, solidarity in managing the European crisis. Of course, populist forces are exploiting at the moment the anti-European feeling of the Italian population, pushing the countries in a very dangerous sovereignties and nationalist direction. But I remain convinced that progressive forces could develop an argument in favor of Europe in Italy, precisely making the case for more Europe, but a different kind of Europe.
It's very interesting to think about that idea of more Europe, but a different kind of Europe. And is the problem we're seeing across Europe in some ways is a breakdown in that feedback mechanism between European citizens and the European institutions? And how might we bridge that gap?
Indeed, there is a gap between the citizens and the institutions, and your question points to what in my view is the main shortcoming of the current institutional architecture of the European Union, namely the lack of institutional channels of legitimacy whereby citizens can feel they have a stake in the process of European integration. Of course, citizens vote for the European Parliament. Of course, citizens vote for national elections and therefore elect governments that are sitting in the Council and the European Council. But the functioning of the European Union is more complicated by the fact that on a number of key policy areas, intergovernmentalism is actually the game in town. And in an intergovernmental system, the ability of different states to influence the policy decisions, it's very limited. So what I think is the European Union needs institutional reforms that create channels of contestation and legitimacy on European policy, particularly at the level of the executive. The EU has a fairly established judicial power. It has a quite functioning legislative power with the Council and the European Parliament. What we really lack in the European Union is an executive branch that enjoys the legitimation of European citizens. And I think in a union of states and citizens like Europe, with very diverse national identities and national preferences, there ought to be a process and an institutional mechanism whereby all the citizens across Europe can feel they have a voice in choosing who's leading them at the European level.
One of the initiatives to address that very issue was the Spitzenkandidaten to essentially elect by proxy the head of the Commission after the last European elections. And at the moment we're seeing a case where candidates are manoeuvring themselves into position again. But that, I suppose, brings into tension some of the formal rules of the European Union, the relationship between the different institutions. And how do you see, will the Spitzenkandidaten evolve into something like that, formal legitimacy for the Commission, or will we have to invoke some sort of different institutional resolution?
I think there are some practical questions whether the Spitzenkandidaten process is able to deliver, and the fact that we don't really know yet whether the next European Parliament election in 2019, this mechanism will be used again, testifies to the challenges that are connected to this mechanism. But besides this practical question, I think there are also deeper theoretical issues connected with this institutional avenue to politicize Europe. And the reason is that the Spitzenkandidaten process essentially is premised on the assumption that the European Union can function as a parliamentary system where you have competing political parties which are running elections with the aim of getting a majority and to form a government. But as I was saying before, I think a union of states and citizens, often of asymmetric side and with different national identities, cannot be governed through an institutional system which is a fusion of power system, parliamentary regime. I think we need a separation of power system where different institutions, each with its own legitimacy, are sharing the power, and where the government is a process of combining different legitimacy of this institution. So in my view, we should probably think anew about efforts at institutional reforms. In my own scholarship, I've been suggesting some avenues forward, but I would not put too much faith into the Spitzenkandidaten process, which ultimately crowns some 50 years of attempt at parliamentarizing the EU since 1979, when the European Parliament was elected, but which admittedly have not been extremely successful.
So we're just discussing the question of institutional reform and the need for a certain degree of democratic legitimacy at the very centre of the European Union. And that brings us nicely to the big question, or the elephant in the room, certainly in this part of the world, is the question of Brexit. Because one of the slogans of that referendum campaign was about take back control, and the sense that the Leave campaign in the UK tapped very much into that sense of citizens' unease about their sense of control over the decisions that affected their daily lives. What's been quite interesting for me, looking at the EU more broadly, has been the relative lack of change or adjustment within the EU itself in response to the Brexit question. What do you think is driving that?
Let me start by saying something about Brexit itself. It is true that the United Kingdom voted to leave also because of what you describe as citizens' unease with the process of European integration and lack of control of it. And yet I do think there is something quite peculiar to the United Kingdom itself in the decision to leave the EU. Ultimately, I am of the view that the UK totally misunderstood what the process of integration was about since the time it joined the then European Economic Communities in the 1970s, because essentially it thought that the then EEC was exclusively an economic project, whereas in fact, for the founding member state, the economic dimension was exclusively the tool to achieve a political aim of deeper integration after two world wars. And therefore, the position of the UK within the European Union has become increasingly awkward, particularly from the 1990s onwards, when the political element of integration all of a sudden re-emerged in the process with the creation of the single currency, a common citizenship, integration in the field of security and justice and foreign affairs. So in hindsight, I think the decision of the UK to leave the European Union was somehow inevitable because Europe had become much more than a simple free trade area, an economic enterprise. It has become, but in fact, it was originally designed to become a political project. And I think the UK, for historical reason, has challenges in remaining in such a condominium. And that brings me to the point you were raising, whether the EU has changed or not after Brexit. And I think it hasn't, because ultimately it has remained coherent with its own principles that the UK wanted to challenge and wanted to undermine when it was a member state. People will recall the efforts by Prime Minister David Cameron to renegotiate the position of the UK within the EU, and one of the main goals of that renegotiation was to exempt the UK from the process of ever closer union. But that is not just a slogan for Europe, it's really an ambition of deepening ties between states which had been fighting two world wars between each other in the last century. The key challenges ahead is in what ways the UK will leave the European Union. Will it be an orderly withdrawal? And what will be the relations in the future between the EU and the UK? Will they be close economic connections, or are we veering off from each other?
It's interesting that you pick up in the sense that the UK misunderstood the purpose of integration while it was still a member state. The difficulties we're currently experiencing in the context of Brexit negotiations, is this a case of the UK again misunderstanding the nature of withdrawal?
I think the UK mishandled the negotiation process. It wrongly assessed its own strength vis-à-vis the European Union. And if we look at the way how the negotiations have unfolded since the UK notified its decision of leaving the European Union, we see that actually all the points the European Union sort of requested were ultimately met. So it has been really the European Union calling the shot in the whole process. The challenge ahead, as I was saying, is to see whether we are able to avoid a hard Brexit, a disorderly withdrawal of the UK from the EU, and whether, therefore, there might be a period of transition to phase out the UK from membership, and then sustainable future relations.
Broadening out, I think, from the EU question itself, because these issues around nativism, around political legitimacy, around the relationship between the political system or the legal system and economic relations is not unique to the European continent. And one of the most challenging features of the international environment is the changing role of the United States, who's long been seen as, I guess, an underwriter of the international legal order. Do you think the current tensions in the transatlantic relationship are a temporary blip, or do you think they represent a transformed relationship between the EU and the United States, and then by proxy, the rest of the world?
I think the transformations we are witnessing in the transatlantic relations, are long-lasting, and they will have a very profound impact on the future of Europe. In Europe, sometimes we tend to be parochial and look at our own problems as isolated from the broader geopolitical, geoeconomic challenges of the world. In reality, the European Union could not have become what it became if the United States didn't act as a supporting power as they have been since the end of World War II. And the fact that for the first time in 70 years, the US administration is now looking at the European Union as a potential foe rather than as a friend or an ally, it's a fundamental change that forces Europe to reckon with the reality of the 21st century and also take up its responsibility in areas like security, foreign affairs, and defense, where traditionally we could essentially free ride on the American nuclear power defense system and focus on other priorities. That has gone. Certainly the Trump administration made the change very visible in often quite striking ways, but there is a deep undercurrent of transformation in the United States, which in fact goes back to the two prior administration, and which is not going to change with the next administration that thinks that Europe ought to take great responsibility for its own security, that it ought to rely less on American military and diplomatic power, and it won't be easy for Europe to readapt to that reality, but it has to, because the change is going to stay.
Picking up on that theme of change and asking you to project forward and perhaps look into a crystal ball a little bit. Eric Hobsbawm's history of the 20th century is titled The Age of Extremes, and Mark Mazar's history of Europe in the same period is Dark Continent. How do you think historians will describe the 21st century?
A great advantage of historians is that they're looking back, and so it's easier, of course, to put labels on specific historical periods with the benefits of hindsight, so to speak. I am a lawyer, so I don't think I'm ideally placed to give a definition of the 21st century, since, in fact, 4/5 of the 21st century are still to be lived and witnessed. But I do think, based on the discussion we have and the description of all the challenges that Europe is facing at the minute, that we are entering a critical period in the process of European integration. And we are essentially reaching a cross point where we might move towards the direction of a European Renaissance with a refoundation of Europe and new mechanism of democratic legitimacy and citizen participation. Or in fact, we might take a different turn and move back towards a kind of new medieval Europe with greater fragmentation, greater division, neo-nativism, and unfortunately, all the conflicts that this will inevitably produce for Europe. I do remain hopeful that we might be able to take the road towards the Renaissance as opposed to the medieval era, but this is for the political class and the citizens of Europe to sort out by themselves.
Professor Fabbrini, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.